Campaign promises of eliminating hundreds of nuisance taxes, but how much money could this plan really save voters? And is the current administration's claim that their cuts are more effective true? But first, election reform in Connecticut. On the ballot in November, you will decide if Connecticut should have early voting. What could that look like, and why does it matter? This morning, we'll speak with one organization advocating for this change. Good Sunday morning, and thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wolforst. This November, Connecticut voters will decide if they want the option of voting in person before Election Day in future elections. That question coming in the form of a referendum on this year's ballot. With us this morning, President of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut, Laura Smits. The League of Women Voters is a leader in voting reform nationwide, and here in Connecticut, Smits has been a member of the League since 1999. While raising her family in Weston, Connecticut, Laura has served in a number of different elected town positions. She is also a certified elections moderator in the city of Norwalk. Thanks so much for joining us, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Let's talk first about the possibility of early voting here. The Connecticut Allow for Early Voting Amendment is on the November 8th ballot as a constitutional amendment. If passed, it would change the state constitution to allow the Connecticut General Assembly to pass laws to provide for early voting in person here, meaning a voter does not need to give an excuse for being unable to vote on Election Day. So what is early voting, and what could this look like for Connecticut voters?
Well, Emma, it's interesting. It could look very simple or very complicated. That's one of the reasons why the question is to the voters just to amend the Constitution so that the legislature can involve all the stakeholders so that we know how many days are acceptable, what each town will have to do it. But it's about in-person voting. And if you've ever voted in person versus absentee, you know that it's a very special feeling. It's a good community thing. You feel like you've done your civic duty. So it's very important that we give folks another day, another full day of voting. So that they can actually exercise that right in person, just like they do on Election Day. But not everybody has the ability to be there on a Tuesday between those hours, believe it or not. We are, people who take care of children, take care of the elderly, people who have jobs that are shifts. So there's a lot of folks who would like to vote in person, but are not able to on Election Day for a variety of reasons.
Right now, 39 states have early voting laws. Connecticut, one of only 11 that don't. Why hasn't Connecticut enacted it yet?
Well, some of it is because we have our election laws are in the Constitution. We are in the Constitution state. In this case, makes it a little more cumbersome, so that when we do make these kinds of changes, we need to go back to the voters to allow us to amend the Constitution to do so. We are actually one of 4 states that does not have a form of early voting. So it's getting less and less every year. More and more states are doing early voting. Their voters really want it. It's helpful to folks who need to schedule transportation. And it's also just nice to, why are we making it difficult for eligible citizens to vote, right? It should be convenient. And so an extra day of in-person voting would do just that.
You mentioned before one day. Why is that one day so significant? Some might say, well, that's only one extra day. If you can come out on a Monday, why can't you come out on a Tuesday? So why is that one day so significant?
Well, there's some people that, for instance, if you're an elderly person and you can't drive, you might have to rely on someone else who has a schedule, who has a set schedule, so you might not be able to do it exactly on Election Day. So it's basically just to make it more convenient. Tuesday, in my opinion, Election Day should be a holiday, but it's not. So it's difficult for some to get there via their transportation, or at least this way they're like, oh my gosh, it's Election Day, I forgot to vote. They don't have to think about it. There might be an extra day that they can go before Election Day so that they can get that done without having to worry about Election Day itself.
Connecticut voters have considered early voting before that constitutional amendment defeated in 2014. It would have allowed early voting and removed restrictions for absentee voting. Why do you think residents weren't ready for early voting 8 years ago?
I think it really wasn't that they weren't ready. I believe most voters, if asked, would want some kind of option besides Election Day. I think the question, I don't know if you saw it, but it took up half the ballot. It was like a paragraph of legalese, and it wasn't very user-friendly, if you will. So I think this time around, there's a lot more education about this. We've been talking about it for a long time, ever since that defeat in 2014. And I think folks are starting to understand that the reason we have that ballot question down to one sentence this year is so that folks can easily understand what it means and vote for it.
So do you think voters are ready now? You mentioned more and more states adding that early voting law. Do you think this year is the year?
I hope it's the year. I think it, and let's not forget that a vote on this question just gets us to let the legislature figure out what it looks like. It's not automatically early voting. So it would take a year or two for the legislature to work out the details. So we actually would not be able to vote early, probably for another 2 years.
All right, and early voting often gets the blame for concerns about election security, as well as mail-in voting and absentee ballots. Does early voting threaten election security? Are there more risks if we implement this?
Not at all, because the same rules that apply on Election Day with regard to security, the machines and the people that would manage them are the same. We'd have the same number of folks watching the tabulator. It would be in a secure location. There would be the same kind of rules that happen on Election Day. So all of those checks and balances that are in place on Election Day would also be there for early voting.
Okay, now to ranked choice voting. What is ranked choice voting, for those who don't know, and how is it different from the way we vote now in Connecticut?
So ranked choice voting, I hope I explained this right, because it is a little complicated, but it makes a lot more sense. It basically, if you, rather than saying, okay, you vote for one person, you get to decide your top 3 choices. And then after that one person is eliminated, you still have a say in the next 2 choices. Say if there's 3 choices, you would have a say into that next choice would get ranked and therefore could continue on. So it's kind of like you have more of a say in how the votes get cast, because your top choice doesn't make it, but your second or third choice might make it. So it actually gives the voter more options.
You mentioned that it's a little bit complicated, but it makes more sense. Why do you think it makes more sense for Connecticut voters to vote this way?
Well, the thing that is interesting about ranked choice voting, it also makes the candidates have to work harder, right? They can't just rely on their first choice. If they don't like that, they're done. If you're the second or third choice, it gives candidates another shot at being one of the choices for each voter.
Connecticut currently requires only a plurality, not a majority, to win a primary or general election, meaning candidates can win with less than 50% of the vote. Is that an issue, being able to win with less than 50% of the vote?
Well, it's really all about turnout. So if people don't turn out, that's what the percentages are. And they're always incredibly low during primaries. As we have seen, we have a closed primary state, so that makes it a little tricky. But it is kind of disturbing when you see those kinds of turnout rates, but I think it is what it is. People who show up are the ones who get to decide.
You mentioned Connecticut being a closed primary state. Obviously, that meaning only registered Democrats and registered Republicans can vote in their respective primary elections like we just had last month. But open primaries, what are they, and is that something the state should be considering?
Open primaries mean that in the open primary states, you can pick either ballot. You can decide to vote on a Democratic ballot or Republican ballot. It does make the candidates have to work a little harder for the vote. I know that in Alaska, for example, they have over 60% of their folks are registered as independents or unaffiliated. So they have to work, the candidates there have to work a little harder to win over everybody. They can't just count on the base of their party to get themselves elected.
Do you think that would apply well to a state here like Connecticut that also has a very large block of unaffiliated and independent voters?
Yes, I think we need to give voters want more choices. Voters want to participate as much as possible. It's very frustrating to me as an elections moderator when on primary day, how many folks come in and are upset, not upset, but they're kind of like, why can't I vote? I want to stay unaffiliated. I want to participate. And it's unfortunate that they're not allowed to participate because they're not party members. So I think it would be a useful tool, yes.
Were you working in this past primary election as a moderator?
I actually did not work this primary season. We had Norwalk had another primary back in the spring, and I opted to sit this one out, if you will. You can only do that too many times a year. I definitely will be there on election day, but getting up at 3:30 in the morning on primary day, it was a little much for me. But I was not there. But I know that it was a busy day, but it's also it's not as busy as it should be. And if we had open primaries, I'm sure there would be a lot more interest.
You mentioned your experience having people come to the polls. I know we heard that as well on election day, a lot of people showing up who are independent and unaffiliated. Do you think that is a concern here, people showing up to the polls? Do you think it has to do with voter education or closed primary or both?
I think some of it is education. A lot of folks moved in the past few years from other states where they are allowed to vote in primaries. They have open primaries, so they just assume that we, being Connecticut and being progressive state when it comes to voting rights, that we would have that, and we did not. So it's a learning curve. It's definitely an education. When we register voters, we point out to them when they register as unaffiliated, just so you know, that means that in Connecticut, it's a closed primary state and you won't be able to participate in primaries. However, unaffiliated voters have a lot of time before a primary to affiliate. So they do have that option to affiliate, like within a week up until the primary, to affiliate with the party.
Right. Looking ahead to the general election now, the Democrat gubernatorial ticket of incumbent Governor Ned Lamont and Lieutenant Governor Susan Bysiewicz received the endorsement of the Griebel-Frank for Connecticut party this week. Both Lamont and his Republican challenger Bob Stefanowski sought the endorsement of this party, each pledging for support of ranked choice voting if reelected. Lamont said he would propose legislation to authorize ranked choice voting for state races and give municipalities the option in local elections. What does it mean for the state to have both these gubernatorial candidates in favor of ranked choice?
Well, I think it sounds like it's a united front, at least on that issue. So that's a good thing. I think that they both sound like they're encouraged. They want voters to participate, and that's a good sign for democracy.
Anything else to add there about ranked choice? I know Lamont saying that he would introduce possibly legislation, and you mentioned if this ballot referendum goes through for the early voting, it would take a little while. So same thing with ranked choice. How long could it be until voters would actually see that reflected on their ballots?
I'm not really sure, but there would be a learning curve. We are also in a position right now where our voting machines are rather old. They're over 20 years old. So we'd want to consider that when we would be purchasing new equipment, which should happen in the next few years, just because our equipment is getting older and it needs to be updated. But I think that all of those things would have to take into account early voting, ranked choice voting, and certainly the other thing that we've been pushing for a while now, no excuse absentee ballots. So all of those factors would have to come into play if we were to, once the state does think about purchasing new machines. So all of that is going to be a heavy lift for a new Secretary of the State, whoever they are.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us this morning, Laura.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
And coming up now on The Real Story, campaign promises of eliminating hundreds of minor state taxes. But how much could this plan really impact voters' wallets? And is the current administration's claim that their cuts are more effective true? We'll talk with an economics professor to break it down when we come back.